So when developing a research question for a systematic review, there are 5 frameworks that can help us formulate a research question. So we have PICOS, COCOPOP, PIO, SPIDER, and SPICE. So the first framework, PICOS, stands for Population, Intervention, Comparison, Outcome, and sometimes Study Design. For example, what is the impact of minimum wage increases, this is the intervention, on employment rates, outcome, among low-income workers, that's the population, compared to no change in minimum wage, comparison, in developed countries, and that's the study design. And then we move on to COCOPOP, and this is the condition, context, and population. For example, how does inflation, that's the condition, affect consumer spending, and that's the context, in developing countries, and this is the population. And now let's take a look at the PO framework. So here it's population, exposure, and then outcome. For example, what is the relationship between exposure to trade tariffs, so that's the exposure, and economic growth, and that is the outcome, in emerging markets, and this is the population. And then we move on to the SPIDER framework, and this is for a sample, phenomenon of interest, design, evaluation, and then research type. For example, how do small businesses, and this is the sample, experience the impact of digital transformation, and this is the phenomenon of interest, in urban areas, and this is the design, and what are the economic outcomes, so this is the evaluation, within qualitative studies, and this is the research type. And then another example of the SPIDER framework could be, what are the experiences of young parents regarding their feelings about attending natal education classes as explored through semi-structured interviews, focusing on the positive impacts on their preparedness for childbirth in a qualitative research design. So the sample here is young parents, the specific group of people being studied. And then the phenomenon of interest here is the experiences regarding their feelings about attending natal education classes, so the central topic of interest. And then the design here is semi-structured interviews, so the research method used to gather data. And then evaluation here is the positive impacts on their preparedness for childbirth, so the specific aspect of the experience being evaluated. And then R is the research type. So here it's qualitative. This is the type of research being conducted. And then finally, let's take a look at the SPICE framework for creating a research question. So SPICE is the setting, the perspective, the intervention, comparison, and then evaluation. For example, in urban settings, and this is the setting, what are the perspective of policymakers, so perspective, on carbon taxes, and this is the intervention, compared to cap and trade systems, and this is the comparison, and reducing emissions, and this is the evaluation. So overall, you'd use PICOS to assess the effectiveness or impact of an intervention or policy, then you'd use COCOPOP for the prevalence of a condition or outcome, and then you'd use PIO or PICO for the association of exposures with outcomes, then you'd use SPIDER for the impact on a specific population, and it's qualitative usually, and you'd use SPICE if you want the setting and perspective of evidence, and this is usually qualitative. Now let's take a look at the different types of research syntheses using the SALSA framework. But before that, what is research synthesis? Well, research synthesis is the process of combining and analyzing findings from multiple research studies on a specific topic to create a comprehensive understanding of the subject. It's usually by identifying patterns, similarities, and discrepancies across different studies, and then making new knowledge and insights beyond what individual studies could provide alone. And it involves integrating information from various sources to form a broader perspective on a research question. And so the SALSA framework involves searching, appraisal, synthesis, and analysis. And so within each type of research synthesis, a systematic review, a meta-analysis, a rapid review, an umbrella review, or an evidence and gap map, we'll be using the SALSA framework in each. So in terms of a systematic review, when searching, we'll be using a comprehensive, structured search for all relevant studies. For appraisal, we'll do a critical evaluation of study quality. For synthesis, we'll do a narrative or quantitative synthesis of findings. And then for analysis, we'll have a transparent and reproducible method. And then in terms of meta-analysis, when searching, you're focused on quantitative studies. For appraisal, you'll do a statistical assessment of study quality. For synthesis, you'll do a statistical pooling of results. And for analysis, you'll do a quantitative analysis of effect sizes. And then in terms of a rapid review, for searching, you'll be limited by time constraints. And appraisal will be simplified or omitted. Then for synthesis, it'll be quick synthesis of findings, and for analysis, it'll be less rigorous due to time limitations. And then for umbrella reviews, your search is focused on existing reviews. Your appraisal will be the evaluation of the review quality, your synthesis will be a synthesis of review findings, and your analysis will be a high-level overview of the evidence. And then the final type of research synthesis we have is evidence and gap maps. So EGMs are collections of evidence on effects structured around a framework which schematically represents the types of interventions and outcomes of relevance to a particular sector or thematic area. So the search for evidence and gap maps are broad and systematic. The appraisal is focused on identifying gaps. The synthesis is a visual mapping of evidence, and the analysis is the identification of research priorities. But then how do we go about developing an evidence and gap map in EGM? Well, first we have to develop intervention or outcome frameworks, then we have to set the study inclusion criteria, then search for relevant studies, and then assess these studies for inclusion, and then do data extraction and critical appraisal, and then we need to do analysis and visualization. And you should know when extracting data for a review, you should determine what specific information needs to be extracted, and then develop and pilot a structured data extraction tool. But then how do we go about synthesizing and analyzing data in a review? Well, for qualitative studies, you need to do a tabulation with a narrative or a content analysis. Then for quantitative reviews, you can do bibliometrics, meta-analysis, so forest and funnel plots, and then meta-regression. But then how do we go about reporting the results of a review? Well, you can do the PRISMA method for systematic reviews usually. You can use the MOOSE method for observational studies, the INTRIGUE method for qualitative systematic reviews, and the Ramsey's method for mixed methods reviews. Now let's take a look at the difference between systematic reviews and narrative literature reviews. Well, a systematic review is structured, transparent, and reproducible. It has a comprehensive search strategy. It involves the critical appraisal of studies, and it has quantitative or narrative synthesis, and it minimizes bias. And then a narrative literature review is less structured and subjective. It has a selective search strategy, there's no formal appraisal of studies, it has descriptive synthesis, and is prone to bias. The implications here are that systematic reviews are more rigorous and reliable for evidence-based decision-making, and narrative reviews are useful for exploratory research or providing context. Now let's talk a bit about streamlining steps for rapid research synthesis. While the common streamlining approaches involve using limited databases, so searching fewer databases, using a restricted time frame, focusing on recent studies only, simplified appraisal, so using rapid appraisal tools, using a narrative synthesis, so avoiding meta-analysis, and then using fewer reviewers, so reducing the team size. And then the implications here are that you get faster results but potentially lower quality. And it's useful for time-sensitive decisions but may miss key evidence. And then now let's talk about meta-analysis and meta-regression. So in terms of meta-analysis, the purpose is to statistically combine results from multiple studies to estimate an overall effect. It uses effect sizes, confidence intervals, and forest plots. And here we need to take into consideration heterogeneity, publication bias, and study quality. And then in terms of meta-regression, the purpose is to explore sources of heterogeneity by examining relationships between study characteristics and effect sizes. So here we do regression analysis of effect sizes. And the considerations here are the sample size, the moderator variables, and the model fit. Critical considerations for both is the quality of included studies, the appropriateness of various statistical methods, and the interpretation of heterogeneity. And now let's talk a bit about interpreting forest plots and funnel plots. Well, in a forest plot, each line represents a study's effect size and confidence interval, and the diamond represents the pooled effect. And the implication here is that if the diamond crosses the line of no effect, the result may not be statistically significant. And then with a funnel plot, the symmetry indicates no publication bias, and asymmetry suggests potential bias. And the implication here is that asymmetry may require further investigation or statistical adjustments. And now let's talk about the protocol for qualitative research synthesis. So first you should define the research question, for example using the SPIDER framework. And then you should conduct a systematic search for qualitative studies. And then you should appraise the study quality, and then extract and code data using thematic analysis. And then finally synthesize the findings narratively or using meta-ethnography. So the type of review you'd use this for is a qualitative systematic review or a meta-synthesis. And then what is the protocol for quantitative research synthesis? Well, here you define the research question using frameworks like PICOS or SPICE, For example, what is the effect of fiscal policy interventions on economic growth in developing countries? And then you develop a review protocol. So you document objectives, inclusion or exclusion criteria, search strategy, and an analysis plan. And then you'd conduct a comprehensive literature search. So you'd search multiple databases, use keywords and controlled vocabulary, and include gray literature. And then you'd screen the studies for eligibility. So apply inclusion or exclusion criteria, screen titles or abstracts, then full text, and then use 2 independent reviewers to reduce bias. And then you'll move on to extracting data. So you'd use a standardized form to collect study details, outcomes, and effect sizes. Then you'd assess the study quality. So you evaluate the risk of bias and methodological issues. And then you'd move on to synthesizing the data. So you perform meta-analysis to pool effect sizes. You'd use fixed effect or random effects models based on heterogeneity, and then conduct subgroup and sensitivity analyses. And now after this, you would interpret the results. So you'd use forest plots to visualize pooled effects. You'd use funnel plots to check for publication bias. And then you'd also assess the statistical significance, so p-values and confidence intervals. And then you would now move on to reporting the findings. So you'd follow the PRISMA guidelines, include study selection, flow diagrams, tables, and figures, and discuss limitations and implications. And then finally, you'd update the review. So you'd periodically update to include new evidence and document changes in the protocol and findings.